I would like to just introduce very briefly Jim Salzman. Professor Salzman is a professor who holds a joint appointment at Duke Law School and the Nicholas School of Environment. He is one of the most respected scholars of environmental law in the country, and he regularly consults with governments, businesses, and has had a very productive and interesting career in academics. He's also a great person, and I think just a really it's really fantastic to have him here. I count him as one of my dearest friends, and I'm grateful for those of you who are here to hear him. You would have missed out otherwise. Without further delay, I'll present to you Jim Salzman.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. What Brigham failed to mention is that I was his thesis advisor as well when he was at Duke. And I have to say, from the very outset, he said, my goal is to be a law professor at BYU. So very glad he made it. So when Brigham asked me if I wanted to help with this, the way he described it was basically to facilitate a discussion. So what I thought I would do is to spend the first, say, 10 minutes or so basically laying out what do we know about climate change, what are the facts, and what aren't the facts. There's a lot of misunderstanding, misinformation, some intentional, some unintentional, about climate change. I just think it's important before we talk amongst ourselves to be clear about what do most everyone agree on, and then where are the issues that we're really going to have to make some important choices. So let me start off with this slide here. Does anyone know where this is? Very good. This is the Maldives. This is an island. It's actually a country in the Indian Ocean, and as you can see, it is a low-lying island state. And estimates vary, but based on projections, scientists tell us that anywhere between 2030 and 2050, the Maldives are going to cease to exist as a nation. And to try to make their plight clear to the world, let's see. There we go. This is a picture. So the president, or prime minister, I should say, of the Maldives held a cabinet meeting, obviously underwater. And the point he was trying to make, I think, is pretty clear as well, which is that we're facing some real challenges. And one of the things I'm going to want to talk about with you, and sort of as a group discussion, is what should our reaction be to that? Obviously, the reason that this is going to be happening is something that we as a nation and people have contributed to over the years, and is there a responsibility that goes with that? So let me just start off with very basics, and I apologize if people already know this, but the people talk about sort of the greenhouse effect, and I just want to explain very briefly what's going on. So the idea basically is you've got radiation from the sun, goes through the atmosphere, hits the Earth, warms up the Earth, and the Earth is what's called a black body radiation, which means that it radiates energy back toward the atmosphere. And because we have an atmosphere, the atmosphere warms up a bit as well, and it re-radiates back as well. So the greenhouse effect essentially is a result of a body warming and then some of its energy being trapped and sent back. Now, one of the very first things it's important to be clear about is when people say, I'm not sure about this greenhouse effect thing. That's an ignorant thing to say, not because the person is a fool, but because there is the greenhouse effect. And you can prove that to anyone by pointing out in a telescope that there are these planets that are out there. One's called Mars, one's called Venus. All right, Mars is a frozen block of ice. And it's a frozen block of ice because it has no atmosphere. And so when it warms up, the heat just radiates into space and is lost. Venus, on the other hand, is always covered by clouds, and it's essentially a runaway greenhouse effect. The surface is so hot because the greenhouse effect basically radiates back in the atmosphere, radiates back, and it creates a temperature that basically has passed the point of no going back. The reason we're here is that the Earth is in the sweet spot. Right? We have a greenhouse effect, but it's not a runaway greenhouse effect. And it's enough of a greenhouse effect that we're not a frozen block of ice as well. So, with the three bears, this is just right for us. Picture right here is a guy called Sven Arrhenius. He is a Swede who in 1896 first came up with this theory of the greenhouse effect. Actually, it was funny. I was looking for photos for this presentation. I put Arrhenius, and I got a guy called Leif Arrhenius, who apparently is a shot putter for BYU. So we got the big BYU logo as well. Maybe there's a family connection. Not sure. Okay. So what do we know? What do we know for a fact? We know for a fact that carbon dioxide, and it turns out other greenhouse gases as well, have been increasing through the Industrial Revolution. So these are actual physical measurements at an observatory in Hawaii. And as you can see, the trend line is pretty clear. We're now over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Anyone know why it's this weird wiggle? Any ideas? Right, it's the Earth breathing, essentially. Right, it basically is when there's a lot of vegetative activity in the spring, summer months. Basically, the oxygen is being given off, and otherwise there's less so. So it sort of varies back and forth. So this is what it looks like over the last basically 50 years. These are reconstructions over the last 2,000 years. This is based on physical data as well. There are a lot of ways to do this. Ice cores are the most common, but there are a lot of ways to do that as well. And as you can see, it basically starting mid to late 1800s. It spikes up. And the reason that obviously, if you think about it, is the Industrial Revolution, where we start burning the fossil fuels that are basically been laid down since dinosaur times. Okay, so carbon dioxide, and it turns out other greenhouse gas emissions are going up. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, those are greenhouse gases. They absorb the heat and energy that's coming back from the Earth and re-emit it. Okay. Another key issue that sometimes gets confused, I don't know if any of you watch Fox News, but there was a lot of talk a few weeks ago with the polar vortex. And they were saying, gosh, seems pretty cold. What's all this about global warming? Ha, ha, ha. And they said, this really disproves global warming. There's a fundamental conceptual or category mistake people make. Weather is what basically temperatures that are going on right now. Climate is over a long term, right? So it's impossible to say because it's hot or cold today or there's a storm yesterday or not, that's due to climate change. What you can do, though, is look at the range of temperatures and such over a period of time, and it turns out that you actually can start to make some climatic conclusions, right? So this basically shows what's been happening with global mean temperature since 1880. And what you see is there's a pretty strong correlation between greenhouse gas concentrations, CO2 concentration in this case, and overall temperature, global temperature. One key thing that folks get sometimes confused about and why people talk more about climate change now than global warming is even though the global mean temperature is increasing, it doesn't mean everywhere is getting warmer. Right? Some places might actually be getting colder. The issue is the mean. The way I also like to describe it, just another way of thinking about this, which is another reason I don't like the term global warming, the way I like to describe it essentially is you're pumping more energy into the atmosphere. So that can play out by warmer mean temperatures, but it also means when you get storm events, expect them to be more powerful because there's more oomph in the actual atmosphere. Okay, what else do we know for a fact? We know for a fact that glacier coverage overall is declining, which reflects the fact that there's overall global warming. I don't know the latest estimate. I've read 2030, 2040 Glacier National Park will not have any glaciers. Sort of interesting legal question. Do you keep the name or do you just call it, it's like a prince formerly known as Glacier National Park? So we know that's happening as well. And obviously, I think all of you heard about what's happening in the Arctic. Right? So this is a slide from NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And this yellow line, is that yellow or green? I'm colorblind. Yellow. This yellow line shows the extent of Arctic ice during the winter. And this is actually a picture of the lowest extent, the least extent. And this is more open than it's ever been, right? Which leads one to think, well, this would be consistent with overall warming. You all remember with the early explorers, they were trying to find the fabled Northwest Passage, which didn't exist because of the ice pack. Now it does. And so a lot of interesting issues right now with Russia and Norway and other countries and Canada, but who gets access to these newfound resources? So what else do we know for a fact? We know that sea level is rising. Right? That we found out by measurements as well. Why is it happening? Well, part of it is melting. More of it actually is a fancy term called adiabatic expansion. And what that means, essentially, water is a really cool molecule. And one of the things that's cool about it is that it expands when it gets warmer and when it actually gets colder as well. That's when you fill an ice tray, it sort of fills up. But we're concerned about when it gets warmer. And what you're seeing with sea level rise, part of that's due to ice cap melting, or glacier melting. Most of it is due to the fact that the ocean is actually getting a bit warmer. And so the molecules effectively are getting bigger. And that's why the Maldives, obviously, are so concerned about things. So who's responsible, right? Who's to blame? This is a figure from 2010 of greenhouse gases simply from fossil fuel burning, which is the largest single source. But there are other sources as well. The key thing to keep in mind is that China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but in terms of overall historic contribution, U.S. is responsible for more of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and greenhouse gases are long-lived. So the issue of who's to blame depends on what type of measure you want to take. Last thing I want to talk about in terms of sort of what we know. What we know is that climate is extraordinarily complicated. You know, what actually determines the climate. I'm not going to go into explaining this, but you can just tell there are all kinds of feedback loops and dynamics going on. Is solar radiation going to be reflected because there's more cloud cover? Is the radiation actually going to be increased because we're reducing the glaciers and the snow cover? Permafrost, what happens if that starts to melt and you get more greenhouse gases that are escaping? Issues like that. Okay, so up to now, what I want you to take from this is that these are basically facts. Okay, these are things that scientists have measured. A lot of different scientists have measured them, and so when folks talk about climate denial and such, those issues really, I mean, unless they're just out there, those issues really are not in play. What is in play is what's going to happen. Right? So this is where we are now. What are we planning for, and what should we take actions to address? And I'll just let you read this for yourself, but essentially this is called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the most recent assessment, and this is based on peer-reviewed literature. And there are basically 6 main conclusions they've got. The Earth's going to keep getting warmer. There's going to be big issues in terms of where it rains, where it snows. The oceans are going to continue to warm, and as a result of that, sea level is going to continue to rise. The Arctic is going to continue to melt. One of the big issues, they do have acidification here. One of the big unknowns is whether increased CO2 in the oceans is going to increase making the oceans more acidic, which could affect coral and other types of life. This is a really important point in terms of law and policy, because what this says is these are things that at least the scientists say we should be concerned about. Now, the key point here is these are based on models, right, and on projections. No one knows the future. If they did, they wouldn't be scientists. They would be stockbrokers or something. Actually, wouldn't be stockbrokers. They'd have stockbrokers working for them. But the point is, this is something, and this is the question here is, so what should we do? If we're told these are likely events, what should the response be? Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about climate law and policy. In fact, I'm not going to say a lot more because I want to open up for discussion. There is a lot of law on climate that's out there. There's a UN convention. There's a protocol to convention. The U.S., the law we have that addresses air pollution now addresses carbon dioxide as a pollutant as well. There are some regional initiatives on the East Coast, West Coast. California has taken a lead with a bill called AB 32. There are a lot of activities going on at the local level as well. Even though there's a lot of law out there, the fact is very, very few laws place real restrictions on how many greenhouse gases you can emit. Right? So there's a lot of law out there, but it doesn't have big teeth. Right? It's more sort of gumming kind of law than law with a bite. So the question is, what do we do? And there are 3 basic strategies that we can take, and obviously a whole range of mixing and matching. One is to focus on what's called mitigation, which is you want to mitigate the harms, so you want to reduce the emissions that are coming out there. You might want to put a cork in a smokestack, carbon taxes, whatever. That's known as mitigation. The second thing, which is not exclusive, is we could adapt, right? That's what the Maldives are facing right now. How are they going to adapt to the fact that their island is basically going to be underwater, most likely, in 20 to 30 years? Or we could do nothing. We could say, you know what, it's not worth the cost, or I don't buy these projections, and basically say business as usual, and we'll deal with the problems as they arise. Water shortage, we'll figure out what to do at that point. So this really is the sort of the three tools we've got in our toolbox. And so I put these back up just for you to consider, because this really is what's going to drive the law and policy responses. So what I wanted to do is basically I've got a few questions I wanted to sort of talk with you about, but really I would hope not to have actually myself do a lot of the talking. There's some professors here who know a lot about climate change, and hopefully they can join in as well. But the point of this really, as Brigham described it, was to get a general discussion among you all as well. You're concerned citizens. You may have different views about climate change, and hopefully what we can do is sort of get those out there and make this more of a general discussion. So I'll step from behind the podium in a second and be more sort of interactive. So let me just start with the first question, and that is, what do you think is our responsibility, or should our responsibility be to the Maldives? Right. So here you've got an island nation that if the projections are accurate, really will not exist in 20 to 30 years. And so I guess the first thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is, do we have a responsibility, legal responsibility, moral responsibility? And if we do, what does that mean? Does that mean that we should basically give immigration visas? Does it mean that we should give give money to them to help them move, to help them build seawalls? So I'm just curious, really, just as a starting point, what do you think our responsibility should be? And obviously, it's not just going to be the Maldives going forward that are facing challenges. I realize it's hard to be sort of the first one to speak in a group of people you don't know, but we're from there.
Just to get the ball rolling, I'm in the class with Professor Daniels right now. This is one of the things we talked about. I was just considering, I'm very sympathetic to the Maldives plight, and it's not their fault necessarily, but if we as a globe hold them or perhaps take some action on their behalf, why can't then we take some action on behalf of a drought-stricken area that we can maybe attribute to the same thing? I mean, I don't really understand where we can draw any kind of a line if we do decide that there's some way to administer some type of aid or whatnot. I mean, how then can we deny immigrants from the Sudan who may have the same issues and be able to trace them to the same type of problems? I just think it's so complex. I don't think there is an answer.
So I hear you saying two different things. I hear you saying on one hand, it's too complex. I hear you saying on the other, it's a slippery slope. And if we start to pay the Maldives because they're suffering from climate change, why not Sudan, why not Bangladesh, why not all these other places, and we don't do those pockets? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Well, and kind of going along with that, does that mean we can start demanding money from Russia if they have a longer growing season as a result of, if they have a windfall, or if people in Orlando have a windfall, do we start to say, well, you actually owe the world money because you are getting better from climate change? And especially if we as the United States say, well, climate change is mostly our fault. Do we become the arbitrators who say, well, we get some from you and we have to get some from you, and along with that, who's in charge of deciding who gets what?
Okay, so there are winners. There are some winners from climate change, at least in some respects, folks in some areas of longer growing seasons. For those of you who are law students, a number of folks in the professor colleagues have talked about maybe takings law. We don't give it law. Right? When the government does something that increases the value of the property, you don't pay the government tax. It's tax revenue. Okay. Is there anyone here who thinks that we do have an obligation?
Well, I think that our obligations are similar to. I don't know that they're necessarily obligations. For one thing, that I have a problem dealing with international law because there's really no one to enforce it, and is it really law if it's unenforceable? And that's one of my biggest problems there. But I think that developed countries have experience giving aid to countries in need, and so we have experience with dealing with refugees, giving refugee visas, and giving aid to countries that are starving or have been hit with some natural disaster. This is really just a natural disaster that happens to be unfolding at a much slower rate than a hurricane or earthquake or that sort of thing. But I think really one way to look at it is simply apply the same principles that we've applied for the last half century to Maldives or any other country that faces these issues.
But I mean, isn't there sort of a fundamental difference, though, in that we're the generous people, we give disaster and such, go to the world, in situations like cases like that. But this a little bit, though, and don't we bear some responsibility because if the U.S. had not diverted those fossil fuels and being where we are, fabulous quality of life, then the Maldives would be basically captive underwater.
Well, the only that's a very good point. The way I respond to that is we have the wealth to help solve the problem because of these things. We have an industrialized economy that is capable of producing very much. We are, as a country, wealthier than as a group. We become wealthier and wealthier with these technologies, and so I don't know that it's necessarily once you start playing that game of who is to blame and who should pay and all of these things, it becomes complicated because it's really hard to pin down the benefits versus the costs to the world of bringing in energy and burning carbon and all of these things.
Well, I just wondered if maybe the points that have been made so far in sort of a circular way don't outline the problem. We've been using a lot of fossil fuels and releasing carbon into the atmosphere. We like to be a generous people and help out when there are natural disasters, but with this particular one, it seems like if we help out, we might be accepting blame, not just being generous. I think it feels better to be generous than to be paying our dues. And then the slippery slope argument comes in. If we help out island nations, they're disappearing because we use fossil fuels, then what about the rest of the world? And if everyone's suffering, at some point, nobody's going to be left to help out. Maybe that's law school talking, but nobody wants the liability.
So don't we have a principle that we apply internally for the polluted pays?
Well, so that's one of my here. I mean, a lot of so this is the OECD back in the 70s. The notion of clear pays principle. The idea is if you cause harm, you should pay for it. It's funny though. In the international context, a lot of times it's the reverse. It's the polluted pays. So, for example, Sweden, right after the fall of the Iron Curtain, 1990, there was terrible pollution in the Baltics from the Soviet states, and Sweden basically paid the Baltics to upgrade their coal-fired power plants. So you can have the clear-based principle, but it's also the basically the catch, the pockets principle as well.
Well, it seems to me that climate change has created a problem of ethics that's much more complicated than older models, right? I mean, if under a model of polluter paying, the assumption is I can actually see who the agent is, I can measure the agency, the willful ignorance, and the damage, and the cost, and therefore require some sort of payment. Here we're talking, I mean, you can do it, I guess, you just showed that pie chart, right? You can say the United States owes 32%, or whatever.
Well, it's not owes, they've contributed this
They've
percent.
contributed this much. But it does seem to me that I mean, I'm in favor of doing something, but I recognize, I'm not in law, so, I can be naive about these things, but
Well, it's not you too.
I think the problem is we've got a model of ethics that's not adequate to its collective sense of responsibility that climate change is now requiring us to have, that has to break out of models of individual accountability or corporate accountability or even national accountability because there's something collective going on and it transgresses national boundaries and it's not, it's very hard for me to know on a daily basis. I know that I'm contributing to climate change every time I use hot water and every time I drive my car, but measuring that in some sort of meaningful way is very, very difficult to do. And I just keep thinking there's got to be, there's some sort of, I'd rather think in terms of the collective community global response or a response of solidarity rather than sort of punitive. So I'm very vague on my comment there. I feel like we just don't have the adequate sense of ethics yet.
No, to the contrary, I think you're raising a lot of important issues, and one of them, where this is part of a workshop that was organized, is on the notion of commons. And so commons, communal challenges, communal resources, and one of the things we talked about is the notion of the tragedy of small actions. Right? All of us individually have responsibility, but it's hard to make that move anyway. So you also raise a really important point, which is the issue of collective, acting collectively. So let me sort of shift this a little bit, because what we've been talking about so far is adaptation and who should pay for adaptation. There seems to be a general sense that we have responsibility, but there are real concerns of where this can take us. If we start to actually pay political liability or charity or compensation or whatever, where is that going to lead? Because there's so many different victims of climate change. One option, of course, that could be used is what's happening with ozone, which is where countries pay into a fund. So it's not unlimited, and the fund basically pays out from the global farming facility. But it's nothing like the numbers here. So let's sort of flip this around a bit and talk a bit about mitigation. Right? Because the big question of mitigation is who's willing to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What's your general sense of where the U.S. is on this? Just mitigation. Where are we?
Probably about average, because they do have regulations, and they do look to regulate what's being emitted, and there are technology regulations and requirements that are put on large producers, on cars, and so it seems like there's at least a sense of we need to cut back, or we need to find a way to reduce the amount of emissions. So I'd say that they're moving in that direction, but it's become such a it's really political. You have these two different spectrums of it, and so it seems like it's less of an accountability feeling, and where do you fall on the political spectrum of it?
Okay, that's good. We'll get that in a second. Any other thoughts on where the U.S. lies in terms of what we're actually doing to address greenhouse gas emissions?
I mean, I think about a couple of political topics. One is that if you look at gas taxes, European gas is $8 a gallon, our gas is $3 a gallon, Venezuelan gas is 4 cents a gallon.
It's going up.
So there's interesting variation there. But within the country, I mean, think about the difference between urban and rural people. So urban people need cars less. Rural people are utterly dependent upon automobiles and farm trucks and other things like that. And they also live in areas where they don't recognize the gunk as much. And urban people, I would say, as a generalization, use cars less, see it more. Look at Salt Lake for Exhibit A. And so we have a real disconnect between politically people who, I don't want to be too overgeneralizing here, but there's no way politically to square that circle. And so as a consequence of
so you see this urban-rural.
Yeah. And it's one of many axes of division between country people and city people in the United States, but that's one that's immediately relevant to climate change.
Okay, what are other folks? I mean, just by way of background, what this gentleman said about air pollution in general is absolutely right. There are a lot of regulations about sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, lead. For greenhouse gases, we're not there yet. They're just starting to develop regulations for coal-fired power plants for refining. And so it's a big issue, sort of how far we're going to go or not. The last international negotiation, the U.S. is not willing to commit to binding targets. We'll get that in a second. I want to follow up on your point for a second. So what do folks think are the divisions on how we think about climate policy? Like at one extreme, you could say we should have a carbon tax. We should put corks into, basically, we should put CO2 corks into different types of smokestacks and such. There's what's called cap and trade. The other extreme would be to say, you know what? Let the market take care of it. If it's a big enough problem, then people will realize that and they'll act on their own. So you're saying, from your perspective, one of the key divides is urban-rural. What do other folks think the divides are about to do?
Well, I remember talking to Professor Daniels about this. One of the things he said was that Al Gore hurt the climate change movement more than anyone else who became the spokesman.
You said that?
Because it immediately became so political. It immediately became it stopped being this is something we need to work out. And
but why would it become political? Al Gore speaks out on a lot of different things.
I think because he was a Democratic vice president, and he would also speak in a way that the things that he suggested as solutions were meant to preach to a choir. Is one of the ways that perhaps suggest. And at the same time, the people who didn't like the message, or people who did not want to change, saw this as an opportunity to say, "Oh, don't listen to him. He's just a wacko, a real nut job," or something like that. And so, no one wanted to change.
Jim, I would like to highlight another divide that I'm particularly interested in. I grew up Southern Baptist in South Alabama, and I think the religious divide is an interesting one as well. When I put up on the screen, the way I always depict it is the energy from the sun, it inputs into the system, and I always show, how is the sun's energy processed on Earth. So I draw a leaf, and I draw the sun in a leaf, and say photosynthesis, right? And then what happens to that leaf? Well, it degrades and turns into oil. So I draw an oil deposit, and I show the sun in that oil deposit. And I say we've released that oil over 150 years. And so I draw the sun, it's like releasing the sun's energy. It is effectively what we're doing in a 150-year span. And one of the things I run up against, and I don't want to start the debate necessarily here, but is that if you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, then you can't process the fact that there's millions of years worth of oil that's been released in 150 years. And this is a big debate amongst the Christian sects as far as how old the Earth is. And so I think that religious ideas also impact the debate.
Okay, so we've got suggestions of urban rural is important. Blake is suggesting that fundamentalist of denomination is divide. You're saying outdoor. Is divide. One of the folks who's here for the conference has been a real inspiration to me in a lot of my scholarship is Buzz Thompson. And I asked him if he could talk a bit about some polling that Stanford's done on this issue.
Yeah, actually, I first want to talk about that more because there's been polling on climate change issues for probably about the last 20 years. And one set of polls showed that before the Kyoto Protocol and before Al Gore went to Kyoto for that, and Bill Clinton began to talk about this while he was president, it showed a significant percentage of the American population believed in climate change, thought we should do something about climate change. It was true of both Republicans and Democrats. What was interesting was the percentages overall didn't change very much after Al Gore went to Kyoto. But what happened was the percentage of Democrats who believed in climate change went up. And the percentage of Republicans that believed that climate change actually existed went down. So Al Gore seems to not only have impacted our political attitudes, but also our view about science. And part of, I think, what's happening is, at the time of the Kyoto Protocol, we were beginning to see people getting their news and their information from a variety of different sources because of different cable television outlets. Today, with the internet, we're even more broadly split in where we're actually getting information. And what Al Gore did was he triggered all of the conservative pundits that basically said if Al Gore believes in it, then it must not be true. And so everyone who listened to the conservative pundits were being told climate change didn't exist. So you're absolutely right, but I think the way in which you think about that split is it created a Republican-Democratic split that actually didn't exist, say, 20 years ago. Now on that, Democrats still much more strongly support climate change. Republicans seem to be sort of evenly split. All the polling that we're doing suggests that Republican candidates aren't hurt by coming out in favor of climate change legislation, but they don't get anything out of it. And so that means that a variety of other things seem to get impacted. I'll just add two other just quick things. First of all, on the urban-rural split, one of the things I have, if people are interested later, I can show them some of this data. But I now have data on climate change views for every state in the U.S. And it turns out that in Utah, you actually, remember when? Actually, in terms of Utah, you don't believe in climate change quite as much as other parts of the United States, but it's not too bad. The most recent, 82% of the U.S. as a whole believes in climate change. 76% of people in Utah. So it's still a very strong percentage. Where you drop significantly are on some of the measures to actually address climate change. And so, for example, about 40% of Americans as a whole support gas taxes. You're at 15%. 70% of Americans support electric vehicles. You're down at 40% on that. So there are some divides between the United States as a whole and Utah as to what measures.
So let me ask, so for the folks who are students here at BYU or work at BYU, do you find in your own personal interactions there's a great split among your folks in the U.S.?
Well, I teach an introductory biology class, and a number of us will poll our students sort of say, where do you fall out on the Yale survey of climate change? And when I came to BYU, I thought it would be highly polarized and highly skewed. And actually what concerns me more is that the vast majority of them fall into the indifferent category, right? That this is not an issue that's on their radar. There are those who are strong deniers, but it tends to sort of match the nation as a whole, somewhere around 10 or 15%. But we've got this 40 or 50% group that this isn't something that they do.
Just again supporting that, one of the questions we're also asking is, would the position of a politician influence your vote? And we find for the United States as a whole, about 20% of Americans say, yeah, it will influence my vote. In Utah, it's 5%.
Okay. Folks, does that resonate with other folks in terms of their interactions? Most of your, almost half of your friends up there.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, in law school, we have a lot of yelling each other a lot. So we hear a variety of political issues. But climate change is not on that for no reason. And I wouldn't say that it's because we're not aware of it. It's just simply not as hot button as topic for us. I can't speak for everyone, but
why do you think that is?
In a lot of ways, BYU has been more diverse in opinion than I expected, but I can tell you why we don't.
I just think there's like a lot of just like a split, like a prioritization of like environmental issues as a whole. Like just in like last year at my high school, I was like one of two people in the environmental club. And it's just
the environmental club of two people?
Yeah.
Club is a generous term.
Well, yeah, especially in I feel like in my peers, there's not too much interest.
I'm a law student as well. I would agree with what you said. I think a lot of it has to do with media attention as well. Things that come up in other law classes as well. It just doesn't seem to be something that's in the forefront of people's minds because outside of, say, environmental law class, there doesn't seem to be a lot of exposure given to that topic as much as other topics that are kind of like the hot buttons.
Two ideas. One, why isn't it a hot button? Maybe the best face we can put on it is a bunch of skyscrapers on an atoll. And that doesn't do the same thing as global hunger or whatever, or a distant belly in Sudan. That might be one of the answers, is face that we can put on it. And then I just wanted to summarize just briefly. A gentleman from Alabama mentioned that it's a religion that didn't make the exact comparison, but it's a religion versus science kind of debate. And now you over here are bringing up that it's a politics versus science kind of debate. The message of science is clear, perhaps, that Gore gave, but it was Gore, so let's read it politically.
For me, perhaps that people don't have a direct science in their lives. I grew up in Europe, and at least more recently, I've been to my friends' houses, and they say we need to reduce our carbon footprint.
Your friend's house in Europe.
We need to do this. We have a responsibility to do this. And that's distinctly different from anything I was hearing here.
Is that the motivation in the European community, or are they trying to save money in ways because they're forced by a localized economy?
It's expensive. I know that there are bounds. there's talk of suspending some of the limits on greenhouse gases for economic purposes, which shows that even they have limits.
We'll get to that in a second. That's important.
So this summer I was in Indonesia, doing some work there, and I talked to someone about climate change there, and they laughed and said, "We have people starving in the streets in some places. You're trying to tell me about what's going to happen to one of these islands in 30 years. We have people dying now." And that I think is one of the real...
Clearly, that's right. You find a lot of global environment that's just clearly developed in developing countries. But what's interesting is that, as Buzz was pointing out, the sort of ideological split in the U.S. is quite recent. We realized that in 2000, Gore and George W. Bush both ran on climate platforms. Bush had a program where he was going to reduce CO2. Now, he flipped once he got elected, but the election was based on action toward addressing climate change. And this issue may strike you as frankly not that relevant to law and policy, but it's directly relevant because we're going to want to talk about in a second sort of what do we do about it. This is a political issue. And unless politicians see a reason to vote one way or another, then you're not going to get change. And so understanding why there is this opposition support is critical to that.
But it's in 1997, the Senate voted 95 to nothing, passing a resolution warning the Clinton administration not to sign the Kyoto Protocol unless China and India also committed to binding emissions reduction requirements. So we've had bipartisanship in both directions.
Right. So the question then is, so what do we do about this? Actually, I guess one other quick thing before we go to that. And this is something that I don't think students can have a definitive answer. But on the one hand, I think what you're saying is right. This is not a salient issue for a lot of students. On the other hand, you read this and you think, what have you gotten told to make this a salient issue? I mean, is this what was the day after tomorrow? What was the day after yesterday or the day before tomorrow? It's one of those things. You know what I'm talking about, right? I mean, this is bad. And so I guess one of the questions is, why is this not generating?
Well, I mean, you said developed and undeveloped. That was a big divide in my mind. I think living in developed economies, it is very easy to live in denial about your relationship and your dependency on the earth. And I think if you live in a situation where you're more, poorer, the world's poor, and developing nations are most vulnerable in facing the effects of climate change. So, and they see those effects in a more tangible way. But I mean, you and I can get into the car and turn on our air conditioning or our heater or whatever it is we need to do to shield ourselves from the effects of weather and climate. And we have a very strong ideology that's associated with that. Right? I mean, if I work an honest living and I do what I'm supposed to do, then I deserve to live in a certain kind of level of comfort and pleasure for myself and my family, and everyone else can't tell me that I should change that picture. So there's something ethically wrong with the worldview that's that cut off from the reality, not just of the planet itself, which is in and of itself a major problem, but cut off from the reality of global population and what they're dealing with.
So that actually leads nicely to the question I had, is the one and round one, and put into the chat as well as we want. We've got some law on the books. Interestingly, California is clearly taking the lead on this issue. And so there have been efforts to repeal the law, to roll it back. It has not been successful. There's a strong sentiment in the voting populace in California that need to do something. And I guess the question that I would ask, to sort of bring this full circle, is what do you think needs to happen for politicians either in Utah or Washington to basically decide that this is something they should support? They should support sort of, it's sometimes called targets and timetables. They should support binding reductions on certain types of greenhouse gases, which California, in many respects, is trying to lead the way on, but there's only so far California can go.
We need a non-bankrupt state to do it.
Okay, so you're saying, all right.
Well, I think that actually today in the New York Times it was interesting. There was an article about big business that is now being motivated because of climate change. And I think that, you know, the politicians historically haven't always been motivated by the voice of a single voter. But when Coca-Cola and Walmart and these large companies say climate change is hurting the bottom line and it's economically disastrous for us, they begin to make a clear connection between economics and policy.
That's the money talks.
Yeah.
I have a colleague at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who is a specialist in risk management, insurance, and reinsurance. And he said big because they're the ones that bear the economic brunt of some of these disastrous events. They pay for it. And I think that's, in a way, within the commercial sector, they're really by losing the leverage. And I think Rick is right. This is expanding to other areas of business as well. And some are making money on it. Johnson Controls does energy efficiency for buildings in ways that pay for themselves. So they need to weigh into some grassroots supporters there. How to get to this? People on the street not weeds. There's a real challenge because there's not, I gather from the polls, a sense of urgency.
They don't just the polls. This is the discussion of the room. It's consistent with that. So I guess I have a question for the students. And that is, what do you think needs to happen for the salience, for the concern to rise? So, you know, the environmental club that your high school may stay at 2 people, but they go outside the environmental club. Are actually concerned about this. I mean, these are basically talking more about we're going to be in trouble. I mean, what do you think it is that is going to speak to your, essentially to your generation, to your classmates?
I think it's not aggressive enough. I mean, subject like climate control, like you can put as many posters on college that are yellow and say climate, like save the whales. No one takes it seriously. It's an idle statement. I think you really want to make a statement, you need to be aggressive and literally go out and not threaten.
Demonstrating a Keystone Pipeline.
I think so. I think it needs to show Republicans, like, kind of even on balance, kind of hand in hand a Democratic partnership almost. Like, go out and say, hey, we don't act now, it's already too late. Like, I think that time to talk, and the time to act, pass. I think it's time to make a pass, make a statement, make it cut off. Gas supply is not even just taxes, but like the gas limit or like even hot water. We talk about how extreme it is for as long as possible, but I think the data shows we're past
I feel like environmental awareness and environmental policy in general is more of an outside out mind type thing. So when we can readily see that there's a pressing problem on our home front is when we actually have the type of environmental awareness come up. You know, for example, like red state, blue state, it doesn't matter what it is. If people can actually see what's going on, then they'll readily back up what they want the solution to be. So for climate change, it's hard for American politicians and the American people to get behind something that they can't necessarily see for themselves.
Yeah, it's challenging. So I promised Brigitte that I'd brought this around one for the folks in different places to go. So just have a few thoughts to leave you with. The first one is there are examples. I mean, I sort of have the glass half full, glass half empty on this. You hear people say that half their friends couldn't care less. That doesn't give one cause for optimism that something bold is going to happen. On the other hand, there are a lot of examples in American history where there have been rapid changes in terms of things that people thought would never change. Gay marriage, you're seeing happen right now. Smoking, rapid changes in views on that as well. So there can be major shifts to the extent it's a cultural issue. The second thing I think is key to keep in mind is this is going to be with the students that are here. This is going to be with your generation and your kids' generation. So this is not something that's going to be solved. It's something that actually can't be solved overnight. This is something that's going to be with us for a very long time. And right now, we're effectively conducting a planetary experiment, and we'll see whether those predictions are right or not. But this kind of discussion we've had today, I hope is one that's going to continue as we go forward. So I'm happy to chat. Those professors here, I'm sure we're happy to chat as
as well, but thank you for being so engaged. And